Well, if you're tuning in to just our recap, you've probably figured out by now that we like to do a little recap and then cut that out as its own separate episode. And then in the description of that video, we put our full thoughts and theories about the latest Critical Role episode. So you can check that out if you're not there already. But otherwise, let's dive into this discussion on episode 95, A Gathering of Needs. Now, if you recall in the previous episode, they had just effectively captured Astred. Astred, who was in disguise in Chastity's Nook, I think's the name.
Yeah, I believe so.
I don't know my C2 lore as well as you do. But they interrogate her. They're like, hey, what do you know about what's going on with Ludinus, about the assembly, like what's going on in this town? And Astrid gives some pretty interesting info. She first of all says that the assembly has either people have sort of joined Ludinus or they've gone in hiding. And the reason they've had to gone in hiding is because whenever the solstice occurred, the mages, the Cerberus assembly sort of not necessarily disbanded, but the archmages basically absconded, and that effectively pissed off is there a queen also, or is it just a king?
There's just a king of like the Dwendalian Empire.
So that upset the king of the Dwendalian Empire, and so herself among a few others have basically been in hiding. She supposes that Ludinus is in Iselcross and is specifically at an area in Aor called the Genesis Ward. She says that he has been spending time there for about 5 years now. Also mentions that he has been intrigued, like through someone else. Someone else gave her a tidbit of information that while he's been at the Genesis Ward, he's been spending time with something called the occultist Thalamus. Matt Mercer, how do you come up with these names? The occultist Thalamus, and that the person who told her this was apparently frightened that they had even let that piece of information the piece of information go to Astrid. As I mentioned, the assembly has pretty much vanished. The war between the Dwendalian Empire and the Kryn dynasty, I think that's right, Will, that there's been like sort of like a makeshift peace over the last 7 years. But Astrid mentions that this has been largely just like a political move, and there's still been sort of like this shadowy war that's been happening behind the scenes between these two empires, or factions, I guess. Also, they ask about the nature of Astrid's place in the assembly, and Astrid mentions that Trent is hopefully still imprisoned, and that she took his place something around 7 years ago, but she's never been treated as an equal. She also shares, they ask, do you have any information we can use to help us against Ludinus? And she says, there is this one thing I noticed about him, a certain itch on the back of his neck. And she describes it as like a moment of vulnerability that when he saw her noticing him scratching this itch, that he shot her like this deathly glare, like this sort of like murderous look, that she actually saw this. She also mentions that while she's been hiding in Zadash, that a monstrous bird of black and purple fire recently attacked the city. It's important to note that Travis Willingham goes nuts around this point, our lore master of the group. And other than that, she also requests, hey, if you'll please, once all this kind of settles down, if you'll just remember that I was helpful. And they're like, okay, sure. And Jenny, by the way, gives her like a little wooden coin or a little wooden ball that reads "Farts are funny" as like a parting gift for her. They leave as they're leaving the store. They stop by the bookshop owner. They do end up buying a few books, but the bookshop owner actually asks them, hey, if you ever make your way to the Menagerie Coast, if you can check in on my pen pal, who I haven't heard from in a while, and just make sure that they're okay. And this is Yusa Erinus. These are all these C2 names. But I remember Yusa was in the two-shot that we watched as well, owns a big tower, and presumably has some pretty significant scenes in campaign 2 as well. But the shop owner has not heard from Yusa in quite a while and wants to make sure they're okay. They're trying to decide what to do next. Essek basically says, like, hey, once you're kind of done with your shopping, meet me back at this inn. They decide they all want to go, it's a shopping episode or a shopping half. So they're like, what kind of shopping do you want to do? Let's go get some fancy clothes. So they go to this place called the Emerald Curtain. And as they're talking about getting new clothes on, Dorian has this great idea to effectively take the parts of FCG that they've been holding and to try to fashion them and craft them into new outfits to sort of remember FCG and also fill their need of wanting to wear like new attire. They then go to another campaign 2 favorite, over to the Pinto Market, to the shop The Invulnerable Vagrant, to this magic shop where this Furbog and their simulacrum shop attendants are present. This is Pumat Soul's shop. Unfortunately, Pumat Soul Prime is not in. He's out gathering materials, but immediately lets the party know that they've actually just reopened after the city was under siege by this phoenix, and shares that this phoenix, basically there was like a mountain to the east that split open and this phoenix roared out. It's been like destroying the countryside for 2 weeks. The Righteous Brand, I think, was the name of like the military that like rose up against it, among many others. And some 3 days ago, it disappeared, and they presume that they were maybe successful. And by the way, there's a lot of other like crazy stuff happening around the town as well, or outside the town. They ask about a variety of items. Ultimately, what they end up buying is a few really cool things. First of all, they get a potion of speed and a potion of limited invulnerability. They get 3 greater healing potions and 2 superior healing potions. But in addition to that, they get 3 magical items. They get the Harp of Valor, which is a magical short bow where effectively you can expend charges to cast a certain like thunder wave. I think it maybe actually is thunder wave. They get the Robe of the Midnight Rune, which allows them, the wearer, to increase their spell save DC by 2 and their spell attack modifier by 2 as well. And they get a Zephyr armor for Aurum, which I think gave him advantage maybe on dexterity checks or saving throws. I'm not sure. All of this cost, by the way, something like, I think it was like 18 or 19,000 gold. It cleans out the entire party, but they are able to convince Pumat Soul to lower the price down to around 17,000 gold by offering the Viridian glass weapons that they still have with them. They actually end up exchanging one of the daggers and one of the short swords. As they're leaving, Pumat Soul is like, yeah, just remember, be really safe. There's that mountain I mentioned that split open. He mentions a crater that like opened up elsewhere, and then also like a countryside where like merfolk have like totally taken over, and is like, yeah, you should be really careful as best you can. The party then heads to the inn where they're going to retire and meet back up with Essek, and then we go to break. So you want to take it from there?
Yeah. So we pick up after the break with the party and Essek basically going to find a place to stay for the night. And they go to a place called the Lodge of the Eclipse, which is very fitting, right? And it's a very kind of hopping little tavern. Excuse me. Essek rents 2 rooms, one big, one small, basically one for himself privately, and Bell's Hells will share the larger room. But before they turn in for the night, the gang decides to kind of let loose a little bit and enjoy this tavern, which there seems to be a burlesque show happening. So everyone's kind of letting loose a little bit. We have a great conversation between Imogen and Essek where she like apologizes for everybody getting a little bit rowdy and says, we're normally not like this. It's just been a rough couple weeks. Like, we need to blow off some steam. And Essek says, I totally understand. Like, I know how important it is to find those little pockets of joy where you can. And he says, a wise man once told me that it's not pain that makes people, it's love that makes them, which is a nice little C2 callback. But Imogen responds to that by saying, well, a man once told me that it's good to make every day a smiley day. So really good little moment right there. They continue having their fun. And at some point, I believe Fern and maybe Laudna go up to the room before everybody else. And as they're kind of saying their goodbyes, Ashton pickpockets Fern and is able to get a little bit of like the lace from her robes or dress and rip that off and take it. Um, so a few people go up to their room, but meanwhile, Chetney and Dorian make their way to like the front row of the show, like they're really having a good time. Um, but eventually, the show ends. Everyone ends up going back up to the rooms where Ashton wants Essek to take a look at his head. Um, and so Essek does, and he is fascinated by this. He thinks it's impossible. So his eyes begin to glow as he starts casting some spells. And at one point, he creates like this little bead and like brings it closer to Ashton's head. And Ashton's head reacts and like starts to swirl up like a storm. And again, Essek is just absolutely fascinated by this and is like, "Are you guys familiar with Dunamancy?" And Bell's Hells aren't. So he tells them a little bit about it and how it's a pillar of magic associated with the dynasty and the Luxon. And then he gives kind of the crash course on what the Luxon is, how they believe it was this creator that came to the world and split itself into these artifacts, and these artifacts are very powerful. Basically, that's what Ashton's head is reminding him of. So he says, "Hey, you are remarkable and dangerous, and don't share this information with anyone. Like, trust no one. And I'd really like to study your head after all this craziness is said and done." Um, so after that, Essek takes his leave, and basically everyone kind of has some me time before they're prepping for bed. People are crafting on their new outfit ideas. Chetney's carving some wood. But Orem in particular wants to get Odahan's sword out of the bag of holding. So he does that and then he takes it outside by himself. Meanwhile, Imogen asks, oh, actually, excuse me, Essek hasn't left yet because meanwhile, Imogen asks him if Ludinus knows about Dunamancy. And Essek says, yeah, Ludinus knows quite a lot, actually. And it's partially my fault due to things I did in the past, which kind of gave the Empire this knowledge on the Luxon and the beacons and Dunamancy. And that's part of why I'm on the run these days. So Essek then makes this illusion to show what a beacon looks like and explains that this is the fragment of the Luxon, and the assembly has at least one and may have others. And they say that the vial that ended up like fixing Ashton way back when probably contained like liquid from a beacon. So the party then talks about how they saw one of these things powering the Malleus key, and that may be what's tethering Ruidus to the planet. So Essek thinks if they could get enough Dunamancers like himself, then perhaps they could disrupt that tether. And then Essek retires for the night. So meanwhile, we cut back to Orem, who again has left by himself to go outside, and he is sitting on a bench and is basically just looking at this sword that has haunted him 3 separate times throughout his life. And he's just kind of feeling the weight of the blade, which is far heavier than what he's used to. And he just begins to practice, do the same motions he always does with his training. And after a while, he starts to get used to the blade. And then he does it so long that like his arm starts to hurt. And at that point, he places it on his back, and the vines kind of create a sheath around it right next to Seedling. And he decides that, you know, he can hopefully use this for good in a way. And as he's kind of having this moment, it starts to rain, and it's like he's feeling the presence of the Wild Mother. At some point, Fern comes outside to check on him, ask if he's okay. They have a little moment, and then Dorian also joins them, and we have like a big 3-way hug, and they kind of reminisce about how this whole journey started with the 3 of them, with the Crown Keepers, and they're just glad to all be together again. But then Fern kind of awkwardly takes her leave, being like, "I'm going to leave you two alone." And so then Orem and Dorian just have a little moment where Orem says that, you know, "I tried to reach out to you so many times, and I wouldn't have been able to get through some of these hard times if I hadn't have had like you to reach out to." And Dorian says that he wouldn't be here without Orem, and he's glad that they're here now back together. And then they kind of, I think, take each other's hands and walk back inside. And everyone does a little bit more of their crafting before retiring for the night, except Laudna, who continues kind of crafting on her own. And after everyone is asleep, she kind of is having these thoughts about Orem taking Odahan's sword. and she just hates it. And Delilah is talking to her and says, "It's bad to keep something like that so close to you." And Laudna's like, "Well, yeah, is the sword evil? Is it going to turn Orym evil?" And Delilah says, "Well, I need to hold it to find out." And so Laudna asks, "Hey, were you part of the assembly? And did you know Ludinus?" And Delilah says, "Yep, I did. And, Ludinus didn't have many friends. He just used people and then cast them aside. But I'm going to need you to help me in order for me to help you more." Like saying, like, "Go get me that sword." So Laudna kind of creeps on over to where Orym is. He's sleeping and she kind of runs her finger over the blade. And she again asks if it's evil. And she says, "Well, you need to show it to me." So at this point, Laudna casts darkness over the room, making it pitch black. And then she decides to cast Wither and Bloom on Orym, but more specifically on the sheath of vines in order to try to break it so that she can get the sword free. Of course, this causes some kind of collateral damage to Orym himself, which makes him wake up. And he wakes up and just sees this magical darkness and nothing else. So his first instinct is to, of course, kind of react defensively. And he kind of grabs Seedling and just kind of slashes out with it. And I think he actually makes 3 total attacks. And a few of them hit Laudna, one of them even knocking her back into the wall, which causes a noise and wakes up the majority of everybody else in the room, who are also confused because of this magical darkness. So Laudna casts Spider Climb on herself and is like crawling up on the wall and is now trying to use Mage Hand to rip the sword off of Orym's back. And Delilah is just like egging her on, saying it must be destroyed. So Orym continues making attacks, like thinking he's being assaulted in the middle of the night here. And one of these attacks causes Laudna to fail her concentration save, which makes the magical darkness fade. And so at this point, everyone can see what's going on, like kind of a crazed Laudna, like spider climbing on the wall, and Orym attacking her. And everybody's like, "Whoa, like what's going on here?" And everyone's just freaking out. And Orym, first thing he does is he uses Grasping Vine to try to get the sword back that Laudna had grabbed with the mage hand. But Laudna counterspells that, and so Orym rushes up and uses a disarming attack to knock it from her, and then he picks it up off the ground. She, in response to this, tries to cast Phantasmal Force on him, but he saves. And everyone is just like, "Hey, like, whoa, let's talk about this. What's going on here?" So Laudna says, "That sword isn't safe, and I'm just trying to deal with it. It's done horrible things. Like, why would he want to wield it?" And Orym, basically, his rebuttal to that is like, "You are literally wielding an evil power for like the benefit of the group." And Imogen's like, "Hey, like maybe let's just take a look at the sword and make sure it's safe." And Orm's like, "Yeah, I mean, you could have just asked that though. Like, this isn't very convincing to be woken up in the middle of the night being attacked." And then he kind of shows everybody the wound that he got from Wither and Bloom. So at this point, Ashton kind of steps in between Laudna and Orym and kind of whispers to her, like, "Hey, like maybe you should apologize for hurting him." But Laudna is kind of just lost in the sauce right now. And Imogen telepathically asks her, "Hey, like, was this your doing or like what's going on?" And Laudna says, "Yes, it was all my doing." So Fern at this point says, "Hey, like I can identify this thing. So how about I take a look at it?" And Orym sets it down and it's like, "Okay." So she identifies it and can tell that the blade has like a dark history, but it doesn't seem to be evil. But that's basically all she knows. So they decide to wake up Chetney and get him to cast his grim psychometry on the blade. And what follows is kind of this long, dark, bloody history of getting visions of just like the countless lives this sword has taken, tons of death. And as soon as the vision ends, Chetney like throws up from just like all of the horrific things that he saw. And he tells them that this thing is death and suffering, but there's no like sentience to it. Um, so the party continues this very tense back and forth with Laudna arguing that the sword is evil and that Orym is bringing up this is just a weapon. It's a tool. It's no worse than any of the things like you guys are using. Um, and as this is happening, Laudna starts opening the window to the hotel room, but like people keep closing it or like standing between her and it. And Laudna eventually says, "Just let me take the blade. Like, why do you need it? Like, I can use the power in it without actually having to wield it." And Orym is like, like, this is all I have. Okay. Like, I am a fighter. I have my sword. I have my hours of practice. Like, I don't have powerful spells like you. Like, let me use this thing. And um Lana then, like, just tired of talking, mage hands again and tries to just steal the sword from the table, but Imogen grabs it, like, at the same time and tells Laudna to let go. It's not the sword, but it's who wields it. So, like, she just needs to let this go. And she says, "I don't think you're the one that was really doing this." And so Laudna lets go, and it's still very tense, but Chetney holds up Odahan's dagger out of the bag of holding and offers a compromise, saying, "Hey, Laudna, maybe you take this. Orym keeps the sword, and everybody can be happy." And Laudna grabs the dagger and then basically spider climb, like, flees out of the window. And Imogen just immediately follows her by casting fly. So Laudna, like, kind of goes up to the roof, immediately casts her form of dread, which is basically just her becoming Delilah, like a shadowy form of Delilah. And she then plunges the dagger into her chest. And these, like, dark tendrils kind of, like, sprout out and push it all the way in. And Imogen kind of describes seeing Laudna's face, like, trapped within Delilah's illusion, like as if she's in a cage. Imogen just asks her why. And Laudna says it had to be done. Like, what else do I have to give but myself? And Laudna asks if Imogen still loves her. And Imogen says, like, I'll always love you, but I don't know what to do with that right now. And after this kind of initial moment subsides, Laudna kind of, like, comes more to and says, like, I didn't mean it. And she goes in to hug Imogen, and that's where the episode ends. Once again, that was episode 95. I don't remember the title.
Gathering of Needs.
Gathering of Needs. So if you're just on our recap and want to hear our full discussion, be sure to click that link down in the description.